to hand it over to Tzvi Mowshowitz.
Thank you. The sports will be for another time when it's not being recorded. But for today, I have two things that are on the schedule that I'm going to talk about. So later, I'm going to talk a bit about the COVID blog and my understanding and how that's evolved over the course of over a year. But mostly, I'm going to leave the COVID situation open to questions, both oral and written, because there's just so many different things I could talk about, and what people are interested in is probably the better place to focus, and we can go from there. For the game, I'll be doing a bit more talking now, just because nobody even knows, what it's going to be, what the game is about yet, or almost nobody. So I'll tell the story sort of as I understood it. I think it's as I came to the game and how it evolved. I think it's the best way to do it, which is that I've been a Magic player, Magic Pro, Magic writer, even briefly worked in Magic R&D for the better part of 25 or so years. And I've greatly enjoyed the game, and I greatly enjoyed both the paper and the online versions. And I've also enjoyed a number of other games online. They're digital card games and collectible card games, such as Hearthstone, Eternal, and so on. And one thing that increasingly bothered me about the game was the move to what I call Hearthstone economies. Or yes, Isaac? Sorry. The increasingly move to dust economies, meaning that sort of in real Magic, obviously, you open booster pack, you have your physical cards, you can trade them with anyone you want. And therefore, you can efficiently get the stuff you want and get value out of the stuff you don't want. And if you ever decide to quit the game or change decks or whatever, you can reclaim your value. Now, Magic Online, the original, which had the original stablecoin, which they called event tickets, effectively, even if it wasn't technically on a blockchain, and had a lot of the original NFTs in some sense. It was the individual cards. But everything was stored in a central database. And, there was no verification, no guarantees of rarity, stuff like that. You were taking Wizard's word for it. But it did recreate that environment, but it was very cumbersome and awkward to use because you had to use their tools. Everything was kept internally, and they eventually inflated all of their stuff away to a large extent. But then we moved to this thing with Magic Arena and Hearthstone and such, where basically you could collect cards, you got them slowly for free, but you couldn't do anything with them. They were just stuck in your account permanently. And you had to have some combination of completely random cards that you just got. And then you paid a huge premium to occasionally buy or use your scarce, gradually given resources to make a handful of cards of higher rarities that would be yours to keep. And so what this results in is everybody makes the same handful of known to be powerful, legendary, and super rare cards with their resources, and then just doesn't do anything, and then just uses those same decks over and over again. Both you have the same deck and everyone has the same deck as you because it's so expensive and never able to do anything else. This was very frustrating to me. And I wrote about it on my blog, and I was thinking about how to do better. And then when Kevin Fisher contracted me to do trading for a crypto trading firm after I left Jane Street Capital, we also were talking about the possibilities of a blockchain tradable card game. And this is an obvious natural fit because it lets you get back to true ownership of the cards and true flexibility of the cards, which lets you reclaim the things that were really missing and then even enhance them. And so far, there've been a bunch of games like Gods Unchained that have been on the blockchain, but they've all sort of aped the old Magic economy very, very closely. And if anything, try to combine it with the arena-style economy of playing slowly gives you extra stuff because it's considered best practice to get people to play your game to just bribe them with stuff, to do daily quests and such. So the way that this ended up working is you buy a bunch of booster packs, you get a random assortment of stuff, and then you have this Wild West chaos where you have to somehow try and turn this random assortment of stuff into the stuff you actually want. And it's really, really annoying and kind of nightmarish and stupid because you have this weird gambling thing. But if you had an efficient market, why would you be randomly opening packs in the first place, right? It's an artifact of the physical nature of the packs, right? At first, Richard Garfield made Magic, he was thinking, we have to have random packs so that every person has a different set of stuff. And nobody knows how rare anything is or what anything's worth, and there's no efficient market, so it makes sense to sort of create these unique problems. But in today's world, it makes no sense. So I thought to myself, what if we just made a tradable card game, truly tradable card game, but we just sold singles directly for efficient, tight liquid markets and market prices, rather than using packs at all. This also gets around gambling law problems, where like every game has to worry that like they're technically having loot boxes all over the place that are worth real money if they let the cards trade, and we just avoid that problem entirely. So the way our game's going to work is every time we release a new card, and we plan to release a new card every day, literally every day, once we're in our groove, is the card gets initially auctioned off with where price determines quantity on a bonding curve. And then the price and quantity, then as the number of cards issued goes up or down, we just move the price along the bonding curve. And if anyone wants to, we'll just buy it back for slightly less than we're currently selling it for. And that way we always run the market. We maintain a liquid marketplace, and you can just do all your transactions inside the app and get exactly what you want whenever you want it. So we are treating the market as if it is in fact efficient and liquid and real, and making it so, and letting players benefit from that. And also this encourages things like collection being easier, speculation being easier, like trying decks. We're going to have people rent out cards to see if they like them before they buy them, because there's an obvious way to do that. Everything will be transparent. That's through smart contracts. Rarities will be guaranteed. At a given price, there's only so many copies, and so on. And so I was pretty excited by all of this, but you still need to have a great game. And that's the other half, which is that Magic is the best collectible card game ever made, but it doesn't mix with mobile. Like, they're going to try and do Arena on mobile, but it doesn't work. It doesn't really work because there's just so many things that have to be on the screen and so many things you have to micro handle that like it's just a nightmare. It's not a design problem for the people making Arena. It's a design problem because the game just doesn't work on a phone. The phone isn't big enough. On a tablet it would work, but like on a phone, forget it. And so I was working on how to design the game from the ground up that way, so that it would work on a phone. And then I met Kathleen, and while I was working on that, I met Kathleen Brightman, who helped create and sell Tezos. And so she became my business partner to create the game, and I was in charge of creating the game. So what ended up happening was I designed the game from the ground up, both to like not have to do, like Magic kind of has a bunch of stuff grandfathered in. Like it has lands you have to manually decide which ones to tap for resources every turn. And it has, and technically you can interrupt the turn at like 15 different places if it's not your turn to say, wait, I want to do something. And there's a few other things like this where it just doesn't mix with the way modern people expected a game, but because Magic is just inherently so cool, they forgive Magic itself, but like a new game could never do this. And so our solution to that problem, my solution to that problem, because I co-designed the game with Brian David Marshall, who was the Magic historian. He ran Neutral Ground in New York City for a long time. He was one of the major people who covered events in Magic the Gathering for a long time. Deep personal friend going back decades. And so our system, we also didn't want to do a basic Hearthstone resource system where you just had 1, then 2, then 3, then 4 resources every turn with no randomness to what happened and no problems and puzzles to solve. And you could just plan everything. That's also, we consider that pretty terrible. So we did a combination of things. First of all, we split the turn. So this was the idea of, in Hearthstone, you have this great thing where on my turn, you don't do anything. And on your turn, I don't do anything. And that lets the game actually kind of work on mobile because I don't have to constantly ping to see what's going on. And so by splitting the turn, the last thing I do is attack. And the first thing you do is block, effectively. Like once you've had a chance to just do things that you arbitrarily want to do. That gives the opportunity for the game to have full like Magic style attacking and blocking without having 60 billion chances people interrupt each other, because you have to make decisions at the right times. This then led to a bunch of other innovations, like planning cards face down in advance, like having traps of various cards that just flip over and do things when the right thing gets triggered automatically. And instead of like trying to deal with these as problems, we embraced them as uniqueness and like explored those design spaces. And we also explored wildcarding. So in our game, rather than having lands, each turn you build a resource of a particular faction, which are our equivalent of colors, based on the cards that you played. You choose one of the cards that you played. And in order to make sure that you don't just get stalled when you don't have anything that costs 1 on the first turn, you can attempt to play cards you can't pay for. It's called wildcarding. And sometimes it works. And the rest of the time you just lose the card, but it still counts as being played. So you can then build off of that card. And so sometimes you play your most powerful card, you hope that it works. And sometimes you play your least powerful card that you don't care about just to make sure you played a card at all. And sometimes you wildcard a bunch of cards because every time you fail, the chances of succeeding go up. So it starts at 10% and it goes 20, 30, 40 right now. We're going to tweak those numbers in testing if they don't end up being right. But after a while, it just becomes a pretty good deal. And also, if you're about to die, you can just like go, oh my God, I'm about to die. Will this work? Will this work? Will this work? Will this work? Who knows? And so we have a bunch of different unique systems that aren't in any other games. And so we're designing cards around them and building a set. And we have about 300 cards designed right now. And we are busy implementing it. And we hope to get an alpha out for real within a few months. And, we hope to be on all the platforms, including, all the mobile platforms reasonably quickly thereafter, ideally with apps, ideally through the stores. There are legal concerns, obviously, with the real money transaction / crypto aspects potentially being problems, and with the Apple and Google stores potentially demanding cuts at the wrong places, where like if you're not careful, instead of them demanding 30%, they're demanding 3,000%. And we can't really allow that. So we have to make sure that that doesn't happen. Because if somebody is like buying a card from us and then sells it back to us for 95% of what they paid, we can't take a loss on that every time that happens, and we're out of business. Right? So like other apps have solved these problems, but they're different. And so we'd have to do our own kind of diplomacy and negotiation to get that through. Hopefully that will succeed, but I don't want to jinx it, get too far ahead of myself. At a minimum, we'll be on PC, we'll be in, some sort of browser form, and we'll go from there. But, hopefully we'll be able to just have an app like everybody else. I'm pretty optimistic about that, given what we've seen. But also, like, our game is built around the idea that these cards are NFTs. And this has been in the works for over a year. And then each card, not only when you buy it, it's going to get a number as to like how early it was purchased versus other cards, like they have a timestamp, basically. And also it gains experience when you play with it. And so each card can become unique, and you can chrome it in various ways. It can become special. It remembers which tournaments it was part of winning, and so on and so on. So ideally, these cards become extra valuable, and then they're never sold back to us, because instead they're trading amongst themselves of all these cool cards that they've sort of manufactured. Well, we have a sort of generic place to sell cards, where cards slowly get more and more expensive as the game gets more popular and people have bigger and bigger collections. I'm sorry, I think someone muted me there. Anyway, so I don't want to get too into the weeds of this, because like I think a lot of people here came primarily for the COVID thing, and I won't know sort of how much sense this is making to people who aren't really into Magic or aren't really following the NFT situation. But obviously NFTs have gone completely insane this past month or two. Like people are going cuckoo. Someone paid $69 million for a JPEG files NFT. People were buying NBA Top Shots for ungodly amounts of money, and these things don't do anything. So our thought was, we'll have the NFTs actually do something useful, while also being collectible NFTs. And we're also going to be NFTing our original art and all the other cool stuff along with it. And we can, we were there before it was cool. And therefore, we've been thinking about this stuff for a while, and we're building marketplace routines and stablecoin mechanisms and all the ways for this to work on the Tezos blockchain. And also, hopefully, we'll have a functional blockchain, because all of these NFTs right now are basically on Ethereum. And as anybody who's following knows, Ethereum as a blockchain is like really valuable to own Ether. And if you owned Ether, you did very well. But if you tried to do transactions on Ethereum, you did very poorly, because they cost infinity dollars. And maybe that will be fixed sometime, but this has happened multiple times, and I don't see any reason why we should expect it to be resolved anytime soon. Whereas, at least for now, Tezos transactions are not quite free, but close to free. Very close to free, like orders of magnitude cheaper. So by being on Tezos, we also get a much better virtual machine. We get Meckelson, which is a brand of OCaml, of a very robust, flexible, bulletproof language that's easier to work in, and we get a lot of other advantages. And my hope is actually that, like, we're getting approached actually a lot in the last few weeks by people of various types going, we hear that you're making a game with NFTs. We hear you're thinking carefully about how to make the economy work in these situations. Would you like to work with us on this other thing? And so I can't talk about what those other opportunities are yet, because of course these people want to be confidential. But I'm pretty excited that like the things I've been thinking about for 2 years and the economic structures I've been building out will be able to be used for a variety of things relatively soon. And that we'll be able to make those things like really matter, right? Like what you don't want, in my opinion, is you don't want to just be capitalizing on like NBA Top Shots or like JPEGs of things where they have no inherent value, or like the new thing, which is like porn pictures, is like everyone who's making porn is now like, buy the NFT of this photograph. And it's like, okay, I can imagine a world in which that makes you money, but like, it's not anywhere. It's not the same kind of exciting to me as this NFT is a functional part of this game or this ecosystem in this way. And like, you might have legitimate reasons to want to own it and care about its history and its development. So I think I'll wrap up that there for now, but like, I will take infinite questions on emergence. And if people actually have like interesting questions on emergence, they want me to flesh stuff out, I'm happy to answer them. The other thing is that it's Brian David Marshall brought an entire comic book world with him, the emergence world. And so our game already has its own setting, which is nowhere near as enriched and detailed, obviously, as Marvel or DC's comic book universe, but a real third like comic book universe that's been in existence for many years with its own characters. All of our cards that have all of the characters in our game are actual existing characters with backstories and motivations and histories and so on, or at least all of the ones in the first set. Okay, so the other thing that I'm here to discuss is COVID. Most of you, I'm sure, know that I have written a weekly COVID piece, which has been slowly expanding its way to an average of like 7,000 to 10,000 words over the course of a year. And for a while I was doing it, not that many people were reading it. And then I figured out that asking people to click on links was not working, and that instead just pasting the snipping tool pictures of the Twitter accounts that were posting things and other information sources was much better, even though it looked a little weird. And that made things start to take off. And then when Scott Alexander referred to me as one of the best sources of information, things took off to another level. And normally when I get a spike like that, it falls off after 2 days and I'm back to my baseline. And this time that didn't happen. I'm still getting a lot more hits than I was before that. And it's still coming in continuously even now. So that's pretty exciting. Over the course of the year, we all have our own stories. My story, as I've written about in the blog, involves preparing for a while in New York City to lock down in my apartment, then realizing it almost to the last minute that having the kids stuck in that apartment would drive us crazy, even though we had our supplies, fleeing to Warwick, New York, so we would have a house at like basically the last possible minute, and then slowly having to adjust my model of the world as I watched things unfold in relative safety. And I would say I've learned a lot of things on various levels that I'd be happy to talk about. The biggest thing is I've had to remake my model of just like, not so much like, because if you think about COVID and you evaluate what's happening in COVID on its own, and you don't let that update inform the rest of your world, or like you don't make your adjustments upstream of COVID and then apply that model of the world to how COVID is being handled, I don't think you're doing a very good epistemic job of handling COVID. Like, it's one thing to understand, well, okay, this is how bad COVID is. This is how much risk I want to take, and not think about it beyond that. But if you want to understand what's happening on a political level, on a pandemic intervention level, on a civilizational level, you have to have a model that predicts that this will happen, that isn't just full of a lot of very specific narrow code that says that this applies only to this specific pandemic or to pandemics. It really needs to apply to a lot of things. And so I had just finished writing the Moral Mazes sequence. I had been exploring simulacra. I think without those explorations, which I'm not going to get into in detail here because it would just take forever, but I am happy to answer questions if people want briefings or to explore them further in interesting detail. Without the understanding of these ways in which our entire structure of power in our society is completely perverse, and how a lot of things are not what they look like and have been optimized for exactly the opposite of what they seem to be optimized for on first glance, and how like our systems just generally fail a lot in ways that don't seem plausible if you don't have any of the underlying mechanisms down. Like if you just have a sort of naive view, even an equilibrium style view, like doesn't really explain them. Like there's like this thing where like you wake up and you join the world and you assume that everything happens because like, well, sometimes these problems are hard and there's mistakes that are made and there's conflicts over who wants what. And like, not everybody knows everything, and like people can be stupid, and like it doesn't work out. And then you realize it doesn't explain everything. And then you get like inadequate equilibria or like other like economic explanations and like higher level stuff, and you realize that like then you realize that doesn't really explain it either. It just like is less terrible at explaining it. And then you get to like the moral mazes, simulacra, mode of ambiguity, like asymmetric justice. Like, I mean, I'm using my own terms here, but like there's general terms for them. Copenhagen interpretation is probably just an even better part of it. And just general blame avoidance being very, very central. And like people not having object level models of what's going on at all when they're in positions of power, and not caring about the object level at all, and also not caring about what happens more than a few weeks out at all, except when it back propagates to 2 weeks from now. And until you, and it took me months and months of continuously updating this direction, but not updating enough because it couldn't possibly be that crazy, right? And like, if I said this thing out loud, everybody would think I was crazy. And I've been slowly working it up to the point where I can say things out loud now that like I wouldn't have even dared think a year ago, and get most of my readers to basically go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Because I found the way to like present it to people, and also because everything we've seen and everything we've heard makes it obvious that things are deeply wrong. And things have been deeply wrong for a while, and this is more exposed that things are deeply wrong than made things deeply wrong. In many ways, we've been kind of resilient. The economy didn't collapse. You know, the hyperinflation didn't set in. You know, people did not go as crazy as one might have expected. There wasn't a loss of social order. You know, the center kind of almost entirely held, despite us doing a kind of maximally bad job at actually handling the pandemic and its physical effects. We kind of like made sure we killed as many people as we could plausibly have killed and did as much economic damage as we could plausibly have done. And that kind of wasn't an accident. And the other thing I didn't understand was the control system, right? This idea that because of the way people were treating this, that if things are getting better, pandemic-wise, people will relax what they're doing and let things get worse again. And if things are getting worse, people will actually do effective things and things will get better. Not just in terms of like locking down and doing expensive things to do it, but also practical things. Like we sort of, for example, we kind of moved from cloth masks to KN95s and surgical masks at the time when nothing else would have actually dealt with our problem, but not before that in some important sense. And it's not like we couldn't have just done that before. It didn't like it cost much. We just didn't do it. And there are many, many similar things I could be talking about. But there's that level. I also had to learn the lesson of, yeah, nobody is thinking about these things and writing. Nobody is thinking about these things in public in any sensible way at all. So like back in March and April, I felt like, well, who am I? I am not an immunologist or a biologist. I'm not an expert. I don't know anything. I was scared of like, well, what if I say something and someone does something stupid and then either like acts too scared or doesn't act scared enough because I screwed it up. And then I'll feel terrible. And like, I'll look like an idiot and I'll feel like an idiot. And like, I've done, like, I did some harm. And like, I managed to write like a post about like COVID's coming, do some basic preparations, but sort of didn't feel entitled to talk. Like, because there are still experts out there. And I realized the experts are full of shit. That the experts are mostly just parroting elite lines and playing status games and lying on various levels to get us to do what they think would be right when they're being relatively nice and benign. And also just not thinking mathematically or statistically. You know, not updating properly. All these things are terrible. And yeah, I could know things. And what actually prompted that was the debate with Hansen on variolation, like intentionally infecting people, where we both reached the conclusion that this was actually a really great idea if handled properly. And there really were no good refutations to this other than civilization is inadequate to actually do it. And that if civilization was adequate, we had other better solutions. Like sort of my objection to the variolation argument from Robin Hansen at its core was essentially, if we were a good enough functional civilization to do variolation, we would be good enough and functional enough that we wouldn't have to. So it doesn't really make sense as an intervention in that on that level, unless it happens to be something you can sort of backdoor into privately without the government allowing it. Which is the government has been like basically the enemy the entire time in terms of their interventions to prevent people from doing things are the entirety of the reason why we're stuck in this epidemic. Right? If they had either done good things to prevent the epidemic or gotten out of the way of other people doing things, then we wouldn't have had the problem. But because they did, both stopped other people and then didn't do anything useful on many levels. They hijacked the system and made it much worse. And in ways that like were much worse than almost anybody, I think, expected. Like even the critics of the FDA were kind of appalled by a lot of the things that happened. Even a few months ago, I wouldn't have really thought we would actually like have AstraZeneca vaccine desperately being distributed with giant shortages in Europe while we literally sat on tens of millions of doses in a warehouse in Baltimore and refused to approve it and refused to release the doses for an indefinite period of time. Like, I would have figured that out by about January, mid-January. I think I realized that was just like the kind of thing that was probably going to happen. But for a while, that would have still boggled my mind well into this. And so I feel like I'm still fully adjusting to that. And also like with the column, so I learned many things. I learned that I have the right to talk, that like no one else is talking about these things. No one else is providing good information. So maybe I should try. And it kind of just worked. And like you can move fast, take the speed premium, be wrong occasionally, correct it when you're wrong, think relatively out loud, and you actually end up being pretty helpful. And it reinforced the principle of like just do the thing and be useful and don't worry about where it's coming from, because like I've already gotten a lot of very good dividends from doing it on many levels, even though nobody's ever paid me a non-trivial amount of money for doing so. Like I haven't even made 4 figures in terms of direct payments, and it doesn't even matter, like from the people who decide to give me money. Because like the amount of reputation and conversations and ability to get into conversations and ask questions and the experience and the comfort level have all been gigantic. I've learned a lot more about how to say things I couldn't otherwise say and what can and can't be said in today's society. And I hopefully have encouraged a lot of other people to say things as well. And who knows what may come of Scott Alexander's endorsement, which I'm sure wouldn't have happened in the same way if I hadn't written the column. And many other things have happened that have been pretty great. But, again, sort of, and I just learned how to write because, you just write a lot of words every week and like you see what happens and how people respond to it and you get surprised. So I would say those are like sort of my outlook. I don't want to talk for too long at the beginning, just on my own. That's about 30 minutes. And I figure like I'll take a bunch of questions, but I'll also probably answer a lot of questions in reasonably long-winded fashion because they'll bring up like reasonably complex topics. So I'll open to questions, and if there aren't enough questions, I do have things to say, but I'll give people an opportunity here, I think.
Okay, so let's go. Alvaro de Menard asks, go back 5 years. The general feeling in rationality adjacent communities was epistemic caution, focus on the outside view, etc. Post-COVID, this has shifted to a triumphalist confidence. We're crushing the authorities and experts in every single dimension, etc. Is this good? Should we generalize this confidence?
So even though I don't agree with the premise, I think the question is great. Because I think it's like that's one of the right questions to be asking. I just would dispute the way it was framed in the premise before I answered the question as I understand it. So I would say that 5 years ago, there was definitely a lot of unjustified call for modesty, where like there was too much respect for authorities, even based on our knowledge at the time. I think a lot of this was based on like, how dare we of low social standing, of low technical like credentials, etc., make all these claims. We want to make only these narrow claims so that people will listen to our narrow claims. And if we make more general claims, people will treat us as jokes. Like people dismissing Eliezer Yudkowsky because he makes diet claims or like makes other like random assertions, like, like how dare he assert this thing about quantum mechanics? Like he's just staying in his lane or whatever. And so there was a lot of, well, let's fool ourselves into thinking that we respect these people who clearly don't know how to think properly and assume that they've by default gotten the right answers. And also like believe the efficient market hypothesis for some reason, which was always kind of a joke. And like, if we just hadn't had those beliefs, we'd all be super rich. Right? Because like, if we had treated everything 5 years ago the way we treat everything now, we all would have bought Bitcoin, if nothing else. Right? Like, it would have been so freaking obvious. And it was like in hindsight pretty obvious. But like, because we had this sort of inherent assumption that the authorities were basically correct, that the markets, and that like general logic was basically holding, we assumed Eliezer wrote, people are crazy, the world is mad. And we just didn't realize that he meant it. we didn't believe him. He disbelieved himself. And we had this outside view thing of like, well, why should you assume you're smarter than everybody else? And I think what we realized 5 years later is not that we are crushing it and we are awesome. Because we're not crushing it and we're not that awesome. What we realized was that the baseline was, God, it's terrible. Oh my God, it's the worst. It's really, really bad. And we're only now slowly maybe getting to the point where we understand, where some of us understand that, how bad it is, how bad epistemics are. I do think they've gotten worse in the past 5 years, including before COVID. I think that 2016 was very bad for epistemics. And the aftermath of 2016 was very bad for epistemics. And COVID was bad for a lot of people's epistemics as well. And generally, there's been various trends since about, it's unclear when, but sometime between 1970 and 2008 or something, general epistemics clearly started getting progressively worse in a reasonably rapid fashion, and became harder and harder to think and harder to have conversations and to do good things, at least outside of the rationalist community itself, to the extent that it existed during that time. And we have started to pick up on some of that more and more. But more than that, it's like we realized the emperor had no clothes, right? So like we were like, well, our clothes are terrible. We're wearing this like random dirty t-shirt and these like kind of too short pants, and like we look like dorks, and it's kind of terrible. But like we thought the emperor had these amazing clothes, and now we realize he's naked. And like at least we have like actual reasonable clothes on. And that's where we are. And we realized, well, we shouldn't trust we also developed models of things like mazes and simulacra that allow us to understand sort of how the outside view could be this crazy and this wrong. The efficient market hypothesis was just like people mostly being foolish / not traders / like people who knew better, not pushing hard enough and not explaining hard enough because the business was so hard and they didn't know how to explain it. And also because like the paradox spirits are pushing back against it. But now it's become, again, pretty obvious. Sort of like 2008 exposed a lot of like, there's a lot of craziness out there in many ways. And then 2016 exposed a lot of craziness out there in many ways. And the pandemic like just drove it all home in 2020, like on a whole other level. And now it feels like, we know that the people in the positions of authority are just not doing basic thinking and not having basic physical world models and or at least not applying those things to the things that they tell us in a reasonable way. And so like, we have to think for ourselves. We don't have a choice, right? And like outside view could be think of as like a reasonable outside view is now a synthesis of the various people you observe are thinking and what they're thinking. And the inside view is you yourself, or like your much closer community. There's still an inside-outside view question. There's still a modesty debate. And all of these things are still problems because, how much should you think about what you're thinking versus like the other people in this conversation or the other people you're reading online who you think know how to think. But you still need to be able to say, obviously, well, yes, the authorities are telling us not to wear masks and they're just nuts. They're just lying to us or they're nuts or both. And hopefully we now have a model of more of like why that's happening. And yeah, that could also be interpreted as like, Kate Metz kind of did as like a claim of arrogance and like to be being superior and like thinking too much of ourselves and so on. But I think it's just the important thing to keep in mind is that like, it's not that we know everything. It's not that we are so amazing. It's that there is no responsible authority figure who knows everything. There's no ancient wizard who can just tell us the truth. We have to figure it out for ourselves. And so, and also like, when we flex those muscles, we actually do it. I think we'll get better and better at it over time.
David Mannheim asks, what blockchain will the game run on? Will the client for the game handle the blockchain for the cards? How do you handle wallets and ensure security and still allow people to use an account across devices?
Okay. That's a lot of different questions. It'll be on XTZ, Tezos blockchain, because Tezos is the one that Kathleen created and like we had a lot of connections to and was able to like arrange for funding for us is some of it, but also because it's the right blockchain. Tezos actually can handle the level of transactions that we need at a reasonable price, and other blockchains can't. Even Tezos can't let us like run the game on the blockchain. Like individual actions on the game being on the blockchain would just be outrageously expensive under any reasonable gas price and like ridiculous waste. We're not going to do that. What's going to be on the blockchain is every time a card changes hands, every time a card gains experience, every time a game finishes, the result of the game will be written there. And we're going to operate on that level. So in terms of how we're going to do wallets, we have a project in the Tezos Foundation for handling wallets that will be able to cross platforms. It's called Kukai. And we should be able to share accounts and their associated addresses and wallets cross-platform. We're working on how best to do mobile, especially to handle marketplace, handle being through the Google and Apple marketplaces and transitions back and forth from them. But like, we are confident we can solve those problems reasonably well. Obviously, they're not free problems to solve, but we're confident we can solve them. Is there any part of the question I didn't answer because there were so many I'm having trouble remembering?
Well, okay, there's some more questions about the game, so we can go ahead. Everybody, you can ask questions in the Q&A feature. You can also vote. And my algorithm is that I try to spread it out, so I'm not asking any one person's questions, but also approximately find the higher ranked ones. Marcinko Rigo asks, what are your major disagreements with the mainstream scientific consensus on COVID-19 and pandemic management? So
I'm deeply confused about the term scientific consensus at this point, because I'm not convinced that there really is in the real sense, scientific consensus. I think there's an elite consensus as to what is the narrative, and the scientists then mostly push that narrative, rather than there being any sort of like the scientists actually did science and figured out what they should do in a meaningful sense. And we're dealing with science trademark, and like following the science trademark with parentheses around the following the science for the second trademark, as I've written in recent weeks, rather than an actual scientific consensus. But in terms of like, so like there's a broad history of me having disagreements that are pretty strong over the course of the year. Right now, the biggest disagreement with the US scientific consensus is the obvious, like, why the hell haven't you approved these other vaccines? Right? If we just had to pick one out of thin air. Also, like the current obsession with exactly what vaccinated people are doing, and especially the obsession with reinfection and treating people who've previously been infected as if they were unvaccinated rather than being at least largely vaccinated in terms of like what reasonable behaviors could be expected of them, is a strong disagreement. Like reinfections are pretty rare, and the general refusal to let anybody adjust their behavior at all for this, even when they have an antibody test, is pretty glaring. And we have a lot of individual disagreements, but like, I would say that like the scientific community has kind of folded on many of the major questions. The one disagreement would be that I think that vitamin D is something that they should be pushing very aggressively. That essentially like they should be having public service announcements and treating anybody who doesn't take vitamin D as, you should be treating this person as irresponsible, and like shaming them into taking it. And they're treating vitamin D as, well, sure, if you really want to. Yeah, I'll take it personally because I understand math. But like, you don't know if it works, so we're just not going to push it. Right? Which is just like mathematical illiteracy, right? Like, even though we don't actually know for sure that vitamin D does much, there's a large probability it does a ton. And a large probability it does way, orders of magnitude more than it costs, because it costs basically nothing, right? Like, and half the population is kind of deficient anyway, even if there was no pandemic. So it's arguably a good public health campaign regardless, just to deal with vitamin D deficiency on an ordinary level. I also disagree strongly with the vaccine prioritization distribution schemes, especially having a distribution scheme that's like strongly oriented towards people who work the system and lie in many places. Seems unwise to me. In general, like worrying about equity basically at all, as opposed to just like solving the problems. That's not necessarily a model disagreement so much as a values disagreement. Like things that like a lot of the things that I just said before they became consensus, and then like they sort of slowly became consensus afterwards. So no longer disagreements, right? I'm not gonna say like I disagree on masks. I think masks are great. It's like, well, everybody knows masks are great now. Or you should use real masks. Like, yeah, everybody knows, and so on. But yeah, I mean, I've written extensively about a lot of the things that I believe, but I think those are like the most salient ones to me right now. I think the biggest disagreement is that the scientific consensus thinks you should trust the scientific consensus, and I don't. Right? Is the meta perspective, right? Like that I think you should actually form your own opinion, and they think you should absolutely not do that.
Luis Farinha asks, why do you think that American and European countries managed to get the response so wrong and about as bad, the response to handle the epidemic, about as bad, but for fairly different reasons for every country?
Because control systems don't care about details, would be my short answer. So basically, every country was working on the same basic core flaws, which were that the politicians, one second, clear my throat. The politicians are looking to avoid blame for their actions on a 2-week time horizon and don't have physical models of the world in their heads in any real sense. And they're lying to their publics about what's going on and worried about panic and worried about misinterpretation and worried about giving them too much complexity and assuming that because they don't have physical world models and because people are stupid, that they told people physical things and asked them to figure out what's good and bad based on a practical question, they would be unable to do that, / they'd all be selfish, right? The same way that like if you tell teenagers what the actual rate of car crashes is, they start driving much more recklessly because the only way we get teenagers to act only somewhat irresponsibly is to lie our asses off and make them think that car crashes are 100 times as common as they are when the impression in their heads. Same thing for drugs, for example, right? Like teenagers are still being because they just have a different opinion. They worry that like nobody would ever care about other people around them, and they're just wrong about that. They think people couldn't handle the complexity of like 3 feet much better than 2 feet, 6 feet much better than 3, 12 much better than 6. They don't think people can handle the idea that maybe you should like take vitamin D and care about ventilation because like only so many messages can go in people's heads. I think they're just wrong. And like these problems are pretty universal, but also just the problem of nobody really, like there's the places that were dedicated to eradication, real eradication, but physical models of how to accomplish something and accomplished it, right? New Zealand, Australia, China, a few others. And there's everyone else. And everyone else was always going to be on this razor's edge where they were asking people to maintain a control system for an entire year, and the details of exactly what they were doing right and wrong in the control system don't matter because the behaviors and rules will adjust until R0 is close to 1, and at some point the dam's going to break, and they're going to be screwed again. And then vaccines are a completely different thing where, like, I think you can argue that, like, different people had reasonably different levels of failure, and, like, everybody except Israel clearly failed on vaccines in a horrible way, but it's not obvious. Like, they're very different levels of failure. And the European failure is not like the American failure. The European failure is a much deeper failure.
Okay. Rutger asks, I'm very skeptical about what blockchains add to things in your game. Could you not do most of what you want with a centrally controlled marketplace?
So I think of Magic Online as sort of this happened with a central marketplace back in 1990, I want to say 6 or 7. I forget exactly when it happened, but mid-90s. And it was like a godsend for my life for many years. It was an amazing thing. I loved it, partly because Magic is just one of the best games of all time, if not the best game of all time. But there were definite problems with it. The first problem was that you had to use their interface for absolutely everything, which meant that like trading was always going to be really, really frustrating and annoying. And you could only play games the way they wanted you to play games. Like you couldn't use your cards to do arbitrary things. You could only use them in the context of Magic Online. If Wizards decided to be pissed at you, they could confiscate your cards, lock you out of your account. There was nothing you could do. This has happened to people, mostly for very good reasons, but not always for good reasons. If Wizards decides to issue more copies of cards for various reasons, that just happens. And in fact, this actually basically crashed the Magic the Gathering online economy because they introduced these things called treasure chests, where as prizes for events, instead of giving you packs of new sets that are still being sold, they gave you treasure chests that gave you a random assortment of stuff from any time in the past on top of current things. And so slowly, cards that were very rare became less rare. And the expectation was they would get less rare than that afterwards. And so you won't have a guarantee of rarity. You won't have a guarantee of ownership. Things won't be transparent. Like, there's no way to verify from the outside that Magic Online is honoring any of its commitments. You just have to trust them. And they can just break those commitments at any time. Blockchain constrains you in these ways, and everything becomes very public. So it has a lot of advantages in these ways. But if you ask the question, would I still be making my game anyway? The answer is yes, right? If the blockchains didn't exist and I had the opportunity to make this game because someone was funding it, I would absolutely make this game pretty much with the same functionality and the same cards. And I would still do it. I just think it would be much less exciting and make a lot less money. And also I'd have a much harder time finding funding, right? Because like at the moment it's serving a lot of different masters it wouldn't otherwise serve. But like the question of, can you do this without it? Yes, it's been done. And it still like was much better than the alternative of not doing essentially this thing. But much better to do this thing the right way. If that makes sense.
Martin Clausen and Alexandra Bialy ask practical questions about Tezos. What is the way on to Tezos? Do I have to buy some Tezos on an exchange? And will users need to deal with a blockchain wallet to play?
Okay, so if you need to know what the Tezos blockchain is, and you need to go outside of our app in order to buy Tezos, in order to play our game, then we have failed and deserve to fail. That is a pain point that we cannot accept. Players who want to use marketplaces to purchase Tezos will absolutely be encouraged to do so because they can do so more efficiently, right? Or to use their own existing Tezos because it's more efficient to use that on-ramp. We will absolutely give people the opportunity to buy Tezos or buy an in-game currency that functionally is equivalent to Tezos within the game. We are exploring the legal and regulatory burdens of exactly how to let people acquire currency right now. It is looking like we will not be able to we don't want to be a bank. We don't want to be an exchange for legal reasons. For regulatory reasons, those things are very bad. So we will likely not be able to sell you Tezos ourselves directly, but we will definitely make you able to function without knowing what a blockchain is by paying us fiat currency and you being able to purchase cards in some very clean form. And you will not need to install any special software that isn't included with the game. You will not have to like create like memory sentences and passwords and hide them for pain of everything being stolen. We will handle these things for you.
Okay. Martin Covrigo asks, what percentage probability would you give to the scenarios in which SARS-CoV-2, A, originated beyond versus in the lab, B, spread mostly or entirely beyond the lab versus mostly or entirely through the lab, C, spread mostly or entirely incidentally versus mostly or entirely due to intentional malevolence?
Okay, so I think the last one is damn near zero. At least like damn near zero once the first like 10 people got infected or something. Like in theory, I can see like maybe 100, but like basically I can imagine a world in which there was one crazy person who decided to go around infecting people at the very beginning or something. Like I can't outright dismiss that because it's always possible, whether or not the lab was involved. But in terms of like, did China deliberately set out to infect the world? No. Was there like a major campaign to deliberately infect a lot of people? No, not in the sense it's being asked. I mean, there's definitely a lot of like effective malice in the sense that like we could have prevented this pandemic, and various systems that have malicious effects systematically and pseudo-intentionally, like not like explicitly and like consciously intentionally, but like effectively, have been allowed to like gain a lot of power and influence, and therefore the pandemic could have been prevented. But I'm going to say that C, in the way that it was meant, is damn near zero. In terms of the probability that it originated in a lab, I've actually been not looking at this question because in a real sense, it doesn't matter for the purposes of what to do about it once it gets out. It's the same virus either way. So I don't have as much expertise on that question as I have, or like, information as I would on other questions. But from what I could see, I find it pretty unlikely this came from a lab. Not zero. I do think we haven't had an honest, it's unlikely that if it did come from a lab, that we would have reliably figured out it was from a lab because of all the incentives to cover that up. I also don't think on priors it was that likely to have been a lab in the first place. I think we have a very, very reasonable prior that this came from the obvious place. I think the Thailand theory is almost certainly a Chinese cover-up, just on priors. That it came from not China, it's just propaganda. I mean, it's not impossible. Again, you never know anything. So like, it's hard to assign exact probabilities to these things because like, I certainly wouldn't be booking bets if Omega showed up like on any reasonably tight numbers without thinking about it a lot more. But I certainly would put like lab at somewhere in the single digits at most, personally, at this point. I'd put the Thailand theory lower than that. I think that like, why wouldn't we assume it came from a bat in the wet markets? Just seems like the basic prior here. And I haven't seen any compelling evidence that that's wrong. But also, I don't trust I don't trust the American authorities not to cover this thing up. I certainly don't trust the Chinese authorities not to cover this thing up. So I don't feel like our sort of failure to find evidence that came from the lab is particularly strong evidence that didn't come from the lab. I just think our prior should start very low that it came from the lab. If that makes sense.
Simon Kovac asks, so do you believe that variolation would have been the correct thing to do? Because it really seems to me that doing human challenge trials with vaccines should have been done instead.
Right, so that's what I meant by variolation is in this odd spot where if you're a good enough civilization to do it, you don't need it, right? Because like if you are, the first best solution is we create the vaccine in one day, which we did. So that part's easy because we did it. You then synthesize it as quickly as physically possible. So probably like within a week or two, because you put a real rush job on it and you spend $1 billion to rush it because you understand the situation. And then you do human challenge trials. And then within a month, you know, like not 100%, but you know, and you start ramping up manufacturing, collecting more data as you ramp up manufacturing during this whole time. And then you solve the problem pretty quickly and variolation no longer makes any sense, right? Like it doesn't, if you have the vaccine, that like the vaccines are variolation, but without getting sick, right? They're much, much better variolation if it happens on time. So like the first best is obviously challenge trials of various types. Like we didn't do challenge trials of vaccines. We also didn't do challenge trials of like how much surface spread is there, right? If I touch a doorknob, should I actually worry about this? What physical behaviors matter? What masks work to what extent? You know, what determines whether a mask is on properly? How much does ventilation matter? How much does vitamin D matter? How much do any number of other things matter? And for an essentially zero human cost, by using a bunch of teenagers who are compensated more than enough to make them very happy with the deal, we could have found out all of this information. And then, you know, maybe a few other older people because we don't trust the data to extend properly. But like we could have, for basically no cost, figured this out where nobody's actually worse off for doing it in expectation. But we're not capable of it, we didn't do it. And so bioethicists are in fact to blame for the entirety of the COVID crisis and the COVID pandemic. The same way that the FDA is responsible for the entirety of it, because we could have solved the problem in other ways if we just gotten rid of the FDA in other ways, even if we hadn't allowed challenge trials. But like we had several ways out of this pandemic and we didn't take them because government and like various regulations and authorities and ethicists stopped us from doing them. But yeah, like challenge trials are like the centerpiece of the correct civilizational response. And if we did challenge trials, variolation would have been a mistake. So like the reason variolation was being considered, I think, was basically, it seemed like something that like to some people felt like it was possible that you would get variolation to happen in worlds where you couldn't get these other things to happen. And that was what I was skeptical of, was right, there were these worlds in which you could accomplish variolation, but you couldn't accomplish the things that were better than variolation.
Henry Elder asks, how well do you predict the planned economics of your new card game will stand up against the reality of a real economy?
So in many ways, the economy isn't that planned, right? Like, so what's going to happen is each card is going to have a bonding curve that determines like at, you know, for if there's X copies, they cost Y, where Y is increasing in X. And we're going to have the players decide for us how much these cards are worth, and then we're going to adjust the curves as we issue new cards to account for how many players are playing our game and how many players buy cards but don't play, and generally like keep the prices. We want to keep the prices for cards as they're issued within a reasonable range that's been like well established by previous games. If your rares cost like less than $1, you're leaving a lot of money on the table and making the game so cheap that like rarity doesn't mean anything. And if your average rare costs like $100, then you're just pricing most people out of the game. So both of these things are quite bad in terms of like new cards and expectations. So you want to be somewhere in the middle. It's the obviously, like, I'm not a fan of planned economies. I don't have an idea necessarily exactly what our cards are going to cost. It's more like I want to make sure that my system works under a variety of different possible economic situations. So like, if there's a lot of demand and my cards suddenly become more valuable, we have various ideas for how to handle that without the economy freezing gameplay. So one of those is that we're going to have budget be our second offering. So like our idea is like, so Magic has like type 1, we can play any cards you want. And then type 2, we can play cards from the last 2 years. So our version of this, tentatively planned, is we're going to have the version where you play any card you want. And you have the version where you play any card you want with a salary cap. So the current market price of your deck can't exceed, let's say, $50, right? Or $100 or $20 or whatever we decide is the right number. And so there, if some cards get super expensive and they can't be afforded, well, that's effectively those cards are banned in that game, right? In that play, you can have like one of them, then the rest of your deck has to be free cards or almost free cards and commons. And it's automatically adjusting now. So that like if a deck gets too good, people will start playing it, they'll buy the cards will get expensive, the deck will have to get worse. Right? And if a deck is terrible, then it'll be able to play whatever cards it wants. And also we can issue new cards to balance. I mean, so like Magic has a like pseudo-planned economy, right? In the sense that like Wizards crafts the booster packs, determines the rarities, has an idea of what it wants to happen. And often the prices are like not what it had in mind. But like it basically works. And also like some older cards now cost like tons and tons of money. Like an Underground Sea costs your entire $1,400 check from the stimulus package. Or a card that I used to trade across the table for $5. We used to like literally have stacks of it in school where we just be like, okay, you want to pay $50? You just get out your stack of dual lands, count out 10 of them at random and just hand them to the other person. Because it was known that dual lands were $5. And now Underground Seas are $1,400. And like Lotuses are $10,000 plus. And like everything's kind of fine. And to be like a lot of it is I want to give the cards the potential. That everybody knows if the game succeeds and you pick the right investments, you can become rich off of our game. But I also want to make the game affordable. We can do that by just continuously printing new cards. But like, and then having the ability to play with mostly new cards if you want to, through these various balancing mechanisms. But I also expect to be surprised. Things will go wrong, right? But like, it's also kind of weird to hear the term planned economy applied to this because like, a game like Hearthstone is a very, very deeply planned economy. Like, you know exactly what you can do. Prices aren't allowed to float. Like, rares are rares and commons are commons, and never the twain shall meet. And, like, one legendary is always going to be exactly as accessible as every other legendary. And in our game, like, if the equivalent of a mythic rare or legendary is a terrible card, it's not going to cost very much. It's going to be essentially, like, the equivalent of an uncommon. Maybe even a common, if it's truly worthless. And so people are encouraged to try weird stuff. And so we have various automatic adjustments and stabilizers. So, like, to me, we are the free market. And like Magic the Gathering is maybe like democratic socialism. And then like Hearthstone is a bunch of communists, right? In the economic sense, right? Not pejoratively, just like in terms of what's going on.
David Mannheim asks, will the set of cards that are available be known beforehand? All cards are available only once, even as more people join the game? Will the curve depend on the number of active players? How long in advance will the set of cards be known? Okay,
good questions. So we will release, so the plan is to release an initial set of cards, which will be released all at once so people have a chance. And like, we're determining exactly how many of those will be free, but plausibly all of them. And then we'll just add to it over time with cards that cost money. The plan is to release cards in advance. We're not sure how far in advance, but like my instinct says weeks. Like maybe a few months, definitely not days. Days is too little. But like these are questions we have to answer, and like feedback on what people would want is very welcome. And then we'll have a schedule where you know some combination of exactly what's going to come out in the near future, and what cards we maybe are considering to put out at some point in the future as well. Like we plan to have like, for example, a silver bullet for basically every strategy, with art commissioned, card designed, card programmed, ready to go in our queue at all times. And for every deck that's any good, right? We immediately go, okay, if this deck turns out to be too powerful, what would be an answer to it in the metagame if we needed one. And so we make sure it gets ready and then hope to just never print the card, right? So like if Magic's problem is that they have to think 3 sets ahead or something like that, right? So like when they're printing the current set, they only have the information about how the players reacted 3 sets ago. So if it turns out that they like made the adventure cards way too good, there's no time to adjust for that and find a way to fix it. They just have to ban cards, right, to deal with it. Whereas we can adjust with at most like a month in advance, something like that, right? In an emergency, we can also just release an additional card on top of what we said we would release with like not that much notice if we need to. The bonding curves on cards will not adjust once the card is released to account for the number of players. Once a card is set into the wild, the bonding curve is what it is. And if the game becomes wildly popular versus our initial guesses / its initial levels, the initial cards will become very expensive. Part of the way to deal with this is we plan to start with a lot of free cards that will always be available so that we don't have to print too many cards that would then become obscenely expensive almost immediately if we are wrong about how popular the card game is. If it turns out it's less popular than we think, then the initial cards will just be cheap. That's like a small mistake. Right? It's not a big problem. The cards are super expensive. It rewards the early adapters. It gets people excited to be the next adapters. They might come in, and then we just print more cards after that. And as long as we have a core of free cards to let the game play, it's fine to expand from there. And then we can use the salary cap system to deal with it. But future cards that were printed in the future will know that that we had more players, and they will have more generous curves where there can be more copies in existence at a cheaper price. Did I answer David's question entirely, or did I miss it? Because these questions have like 4 parts in them, and I sometimes get lost.
Yeah, it's okay. There's lots of more questions coming up about similar things. So Michael Zhang asks, going back to COVID, what are some examples of you getting things right on COVID that experts didn't? Are there examples of you getting things wrong on COVID that experts got right? From my perspective, he asks, how would I know that you're not the equivalent of a lottery winner telling people how to win the lottery?
Okay, so I'll take the last part first, right? I am telling you every week in thousands and thousands of words how I react to many sources of information, how I evaluate them, what I am thinking, what conclusions I reach, how I'm updating from last week, what I expect to see next week. I'm making explicit predictions on numbers. And there are almost no people who are also doing this thing like me. So like there is a Swami problem, right? Where like 128 people predict heads and 128 people predict tails today. And then 64 of the people who were right yesterday predict heads today. And someone's going to be right like 8 or 9 times in a row and look like they're a genius. There aren't enough other candidates doing the thing I'm doing for that to be plausible. And also you can evaluate my reasoning. It's not just arbitrary sets of predictions. Like I'm not just right or wrong, right? Like, and I don't grade myself when I look back as was I right or wrong. Like we evaluated recently the SlateStarCodex questions, the predictions on whether things would, what probabilities there were of things, various things that would happen. And like I did a post grading myself on that. And the important thing was not like what was my log likelihood score or my Breyer score or like which questions were I right or wrong. It was what was the right probability given the information we had at the time? Where were my mistakes? Where was my model wrong? Where was my model right? Right, questions like that. And so if you're trying to figure out if I'm just a lucky guy, you should look at my reasoning. You should ask yourself, is this person thinking well, or is he thinking poorly? And how do you evaluate that? And I'm not saying you should listen to me. I'm saying you should think for yourself as well. Compare my reasoning and people's reasoning and the outcomes to other people's outcomes and form your own opinion. But like, it's not luck. Right? I mean, I could have been lucky on 1 or 2 big things, but like I'm making so many small evaluations and predictions every week and saying so many different lines of reasoning that it's not luck. If I'm doing it right, you'll know. If I'm doing it wrong, you'll know that too. And so take a look at it. All right. In terms of things that I got right versus I got wrong. I got 2 big things. I got 2 big things wrong over the course of the pandemic, both of them relatively early. And I want to start with wrong because I want to make it clear that I'm not cherry picking, right? Like start with the thing that you did wrong. It's only fair. First thing I got wrong was I didn't get the control system. I just didn't get it. I didn't appreciate it. I didn't expect it. I thought like I think most of the people who were like independently thinking of this problem thought that we were faced with one of 2 scenarios. It was the people that I talked to or like trusted, mostly made similar mistakes, but I made it like even harder than everybody, at least as hard as anybody else, and probably harder made this mistake, which is either we're going to figure out how to solve this problem and contain the problem if R0 less than 1, and there isn't going to be much of a pandemic. It's going to be over quickly. Or we're not going to contain it. R0 is going to be much more than 1. Basically, everyone's going to get infected until herd immunity sets in. And that's going to happen pretty fast because there's no middle ground, right? Like, it's like, we ask, like, well, what's omega in terms of the universe expanding and then contracting, right? It's like, is it going to be 1.07? No, it's going to be much more than 1, much less than 1, or exactly 1. And if any fourth answer is really, really weird and unexpected and surprising and improbable. And so I thought the same thing with our 0, which is like, either we're going to be able to implement enough stuff that we can do full repression, right? Full containment of the virus. And once we do, we'll have enough tests. We'll be able to track and trace. We'll have established good norms. And like, we can do border controls and other quarantines and stuff like that, because there won't be that many people who have to do these things. And we can win. Or we'll fail. And once we fail, well, I mean, COVID is really bad and a lot of people are going to die. But like, what can you do about it? It just didn't occur to me, or a lot of other people, but definitely didn't occur to me. We get the thing where every time we're sort of doing okay, we say, okay, it's fine to do worse now. And every time we start doing worse, we're like, okay, we should do better, but just enough better to not have a disaster now. And some of that was me not understanding control systems in general, right, back then. And part of that was just me not having the model part where everybody was just trying to avoid short-term blame, right? I assumed people were actually trying to make decisions that did good things and that mattered and that had reasonable outcomes. And like, I did have the model where like specifically Donald Trump wasn't doing that, but I figured that like European governments would do that, for example. And like, this clearly wasn't what happened, right? They were just doing a similar algorithm, but like less obviously perversely. And this clearly wasn't an accident, right? This is always what was destined to happen in some sense, and I was just wrong. So these are like sort of the related. And the second thing I made a mistake on was I had a very strong prior that because different people take different levels of COVID risk by orders of magnitude and are differently vulnerable to COVID infection. And there's no blame here, right? Different people make different choices, and people have different life circumstances and different risks and make different choices. And no one wants to say and I'm not even saying who's right and wrong, but that like I was taking like 1% or less of I was taking maybe 1% of the average person's COVID risk, arguably like considerably less. A lot of rationalists were doing the same. Other people were clearly doing multiple times the average person's COVID risk all the time. And so logically speaking, I thought, well, if you just do some basic mathematics, by the time you get like 20% infected, R0 is much less than 1. We have full herd immunity. What's the problem? And so part of this was, again, like the control system, right? Like underestimating the control system. Part of that may have been underestimating the virus's ability to mutate. I think it's plausible that the virus has actually gotten more infectious previously in cycles that we didn't fully appreciate and pick up on. And so like the thing that we were dealing with in October, and the thing that caused the winter surge was just a much more infectious virus even then, and the one that we were dealing with in March, or the one that China was dealing with in December. And the same way that the English strain is more infectious still. It's also possible that just people are just incapable of, like, they're slowly going crazy and slowly having enough of, slowly just having enough of it. And so a lot of things are slowly loosening. And just general forms of the control systems, like fighting back and forth. So I didn't get these dynamics were to keep us in stasis for anything like this long. And like, this was a really big, really important mistake. This wasn't a little thing that I got wrong, right? It caused me, for example, to flee New York City, expecting to come back in a few months, and like planning my life around that, getting a very short-term lease, which I was luckily able to extend. And otherwise, like everybody doing everything as if things were going to be done relatively soon. I also expected like more economic disruption than happened. And I think this was pretty universal. I don't think that like sort of when the market was going down, I was like, I'm the idiot who didn't buy his puts because he was too concerned with other issues and just didn't think about it. And in time, just actually set up the puts. And tax reasons, I couldn't really sell my stocks because everything was up at the time. And like, I just sort of never quite got around to it in time for it to work. But like when the market kept going up afterwards, I was like, oh, what's going on? Right? Why is everything just okay? Like, how is this like going to be okay when we're just trotting along like this. And like it just turned out that like there's so much slack in the nation in various ways that it's okay. And like I think pretty much everyone got that one wrong in various forms, but I definitely got that one wrong. But like the herd immunity thing is the main thing I got wrong that wasn't just the initial thing, where like I still don't understand my mistake, right? Like I haven't seen a plausible physical theory that explains why the other thing is true. Like we know the other thing is true, right? I was wrong somehow. And like in theory, you could say, well, just the control systems are that powerful, but like that doesn't really work. I don't really buy that. It doesn't make sense to me. Like something else is happening here. I don't understand it. Because like every time I try to do math on it, it's like, no, the pandemic should be over. And it's not. One of the things that I did, so like in terms of things that I was right on that people were wrong on, I mean, the obvious thing is that like, you know, I called the English strain thing very clearly on December 26th in terms of like the dynamics and what was likely to happen and what the stakes were. And like the title / like headline 4 words was a little bit hyperbolic, but like the actual detailed analysis of what was going on and what we should believe and what we should predict and what we should be dealing with was like became the consensus a month later, effectively. And in fact, people were like coming around to my position like after it was no longer obviously true in detail in some ways. Like even so, because like it became useful for the authorities to take the position I was taking for rhetorical reasons, rather than it was still like the right position to take in some detailed sense. But it seems like generally, clearly, mostly true. There's a lot of other things where like basically the authorities kept saying there is no evidence. We're not sure. It is possible that, you know, maybe. And I was saying, no, really, we can be pretty damn confident in this. Like well before that. And like a lot of those I turned out to be right. And I think this is the biggest value add is just that like the authorities will just keep spreading fear, uncertainty, and doubt and claiming we don't know things. And I'm not pretending I don't know things. I am attempting to figure out what we know when we know it and giving the appropriate degree of confidence. For example, the one strong example might be that like I was very, very clear that the prior should be very, very, very strong that vaccines were preventing transmission. And there was a period of months where the authorities, the medical experts kept saying, we don't know. We don't know, we don't know, we don't know, we don't know. And it was complete bullshit, right? Like just complete bullshit. They were just epistemically stupid. Like there wasn't any justification for this. It was just like science trademark, following the science trademark, like official procedure, we don't know this. And like, we get rewarded for being cautious or something. And like, they were doing it to like trick people into being maximally scared. And like, and also they kept predicting that lying to the American public was going to help. And I kept predicting it wouldn't help. And I think I was pretty much just correct. Like you can evaluate that claim as based on what happened. But I basically said, have you tried not lying? Like over and over and over again from the very beginning. Have you tried not lying? Maybe it's a good idea. I think these lies are going to backfire on you. Also, you're lying. And not only was I right they were lying, they reliably backfired because they were lying. And I don't use the word lie lightly, but like on masks, for example, like they were obviously lying. They didn't not think they worked, right? I mean, I'd be even more confused if they actually got confused about whether they worked or not. And they're like, well, there's a magic pixie dust that works on healthcare workers where they are protected by masks when they're in a hospital. But if an ordinary person puts on that same mask, they're not protected. Like, or like they're going to botch putting them on so badly that they're actually going to get worse or something. Like it's like these aren't plausible claims, right? Like they never were plausible claims. And so, you know, I would say, you know, I was ahead of the curve on a wide variety of things, and I have an extensive track record to back that up, in my opinion. But also, like I got 2 very big things wrong, and I got a lot of small things wrong too, right? Like I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen, but I don't want to go into too much detail. If people have specific things they want to like talk about, they can follow up, I think would be better.
Nathan Levine asks, the world underestimated the potential of COVID, but we also underestimated our chances of creating a viable vaccine in a year. Can I now up my prior for the ability of human ingenuity to solve problems that we'll never be able to solve except via coordination, like geoengineering for global warming?
So I am trying to figure out how to write the post that describes this properly, but I have moved towards something like the Star Trek model of innovation and progress, where like back when I first watched Star Trek, right, I thought it was absurd that the people on the Enterprise or Voyager or Deep Space Nine would constantly just invent new stuff in the moment that they needed, and it would work, and then everybody in the Federation would just forget that they'd done that, and they wouldn't tell anyone. It's like, oh, we invented a new way to transport. Oh, forget it. Oh, look, we figured out how to reverse aging. We're going to use it for this one person whose case is clearly ethical, and then we're going to forget we did it. You know, like, we invented a new weapon that can revolutionize warfare off the cuff, or a new trick that can phase through a planet. It's like this happened all the time. And I now believe this is actually how science works. Like, not quite literally, right, obviously, but I think this is mostly how science and progress works, which is that most people aren't trying, almost no one is trying ever. People who are trying are not trying very often. Necessity is the mother of invention. And there's like treasure everywhere to be found. And like, there's a lot of people with the requisite knowledge and skills and abilities, if they were unleashed and suddenly could start thinking for real and had the resources to actually try. And that our society has lots and lots of the requisite things. Like we're not as good at thinking as we used to be, but we're mostly constrained by social pressures not to think, and by regulations stopping us from trying things and doing things, and by ethics that says that experiments are bad and we shouldn't do them, and like pressures that say that like trying to accomplish things is somehow wrong, and so on. And then and that like it's a status claim to know things or to be able to find things out, and that how dare you, sir or madam, try to figure out things and know things, like, and other such things. But like what we've seen recently, I think, is look at the few places where there weren't people with guns stopping you from doing stuff. And doing stuff would immediately yield practical rewards, either in terms of money or my life gets better in some way, or I actually get status for doing this, and people get rewarded. And you see tons and tons of good innovation from almost all sources that happens scary fast all the time, including projects that seem like they're too large to not be coordination problems. You see open source projects that like involve tons and tons of people somehow actually coordinating with no financial incentives involved, when I feel like it shouldn't be possible. And I don't even understand the gears involved in how these projects actually happen. I also don't understand the gears of how startups don't immediately collapse into infighting. Like even having done a startup, it feels like the incentives involved are always so terrible for everyone to be constantly backstabbing and worrying about each other. And the coalitions involved should be so fluid and unstable that these things really shouldn't work. Yet they do, and they create tons of value very reliably. And similarly, like, if you could just invest in the generic portfolio of everybody doing thing, trying to do thing, you would be so rich. Or if you could just fully diversify, right? Like, don't think about VCs. Don't think about like exactly how you do the thing. You could just have a like real economic share that you could buy in like everybody who was just trying to do some shit. Like because there was some shit to do that needed to get done. And they felt like doing it. Like, even though you'd invest in a lot of morons and a lot of people who had dumb ideas and a lot of people whose stuff didn't do anything, your returns would be so good, so often, that you wouldn't care. You would be super rich. And so, basically, the other thing is, like, think about the timeline for the vaccines, right? And I actually looked at this in a bit of detail. The surprising thing about the vaccine is that it was approved for use in December. The surprising thing about the vaccine was absolutely not that it was created in 1 day in a lab by Moderna or 2 days in a lab by Pfizer. Because, so my dad teaches immunology at Columbia University. And he told me in, I think, March or April, we talked about it. And he's like, yeah, creating the vaccine's easy. I can create the vaccine in a day. Not the mRNA vaccine, it's a different type. But he could have created like an AstraZeneca style candidate. Like in a day. All he needs is basic lab equipment and the virus. Like this is a known technology. We've done this before. This isn't particularly innovative. So like we always knew we'd have the candidate like a day or two after we had the sequence and the virus. The question was, how long were the regulators going to make us go through a series of motions and hoops in order to get it approved? Like if you made a prediction back in February of how fast we get the vaccine to market in a way that would actually work, if you abolished the FDA and the European Medical Association and just let people do whatever they wanted, with a legal liability guarantee that if they had good faith and got waivers signed, they wouldn't be sued, I would say, yeah, April, maybe May. unless they all don't work, right? So either the vaccines work or either the vaccine techniques we have on hand that we've thought about work or they don't. If they work, we'll have it. If they don't, we'll know that, and we'll know that we failed. I do think we should be surprised the vaccines are as effective as they are, right? Like basically, like we got physically lucky in the sense that like the vaccine techniques happen to be 90-something% effective against like infection and further spreading, and 100% and almost 100% effective against death and hospitalization and truly severe disease. And like that's really effing lucky. We should not have expected that. That's not about us. That's about the physical world. Like that was just a fortunate physical occurrence. The same way that SARS-2 itself, the way that COVID-19 itself was physically unlucky that it arose. If that makes sense. So I think that like, if I was, say, elected president in 2024, and I took office, and I was able to like physically disband the FDA, you would see lots and lots of innovations popping up within a year or two. I don't think it would be weird. I would actually expect it.
Garrett Baker asks, will there be a mechanism to migrate away from Tezos if it becomes as expensive as Ethereum?
So this is not something that we have discussed, but if the game doesn't work so like the main way this happens is, I mean, in practice, for that to happen, there would need to be orders of magnitude rise in the number of transactions on Tezos and the Tezos system to not be able to handle it. So on Tezos, we're planning to be able to handle it, but we would need to basically, this is what we call a happy problem, right? Because like the only way that this becomes a problem is if either a project we don't know about on the Tezos blockchain creates tons of transactions that isn't us, or we do it. And if we do it, then lots of people are buying our cards are worth a lot of money, and we're succeeding, and people are playing our game. And the question of what we would do at that point, we don't have a specific plan on what to do about it. Part of the question would be migrate to where, right? In the world in which Tezos breaks down, I'm pretty confident most of those worlds, Ethereum is broken down at least as bad for the same reason that we're broken down, which is that people have not found a technological solution to this problem. Otherwise, we can just steal whatever they did and do it also, right? Even if we didn't think of it in a broad sense. So the question is like, which blockchain would you go to? And if the answer is no blockchain because blockchain doesn't work, well, then we would have to do some version of what, like the games currently on Ethereum, like Gods Unchained, don't actually give you the cards on the blockchain anymore, right? They tried to at first. But what they realized was doing so costs so much money in transaction costs that like, it's insane. You just can't do it. So what's happening right now is you're given your cards privately and you can play with them, right, through the central server. But it's just like Magic. It's just like an old school like Magic Online style thing for now, with the promise that the card will be yours when the network can handle it and they can pay for the price of giving it physically to you. And right now they can't, so they don't. But these cards can't be traded. Like it's actually, at least in many of these games, it's actually much worse than that because like in Magic Online, like they had the central server stored the cards, but you could trade. They had an interface for trading. And in many of these games, they just don't give you the token on their network to trade on. They just say you can't trade it yet. You can trade it later. And you can make a deal and have an IOU or something, obviously, anywhere you want, but you can't actually trade the thing. And so I would say, like, my actual guess is in the world in which we succeed wildly and the cards are worth money and the game is being played and people like the game, but transactions are just so expensive that the economy doesn't work because of that, that we would go the central server route temporarily, which is relatively easy to do, at least on newly issued cards. Or let people choose to put their cards into that, or / let people choose is probably what I do, like thinking about it out loud. Like we haven't actually seriously gamed this out. Like one thing that makes sense is just to say, well, okay, if you want to pay the gas fees, you can have the card. If you don't want to pay the gas fees, we'll store it for you and transfer it to whoever you want without paying the gas fees. And anytime anybody wants a card, they can just pay the gas fees. So like if someone opens, whatever our equivalent of Black Lotus turns out to be, I mean, it doesn't open, but I mean, it happens to own it. It won't be packs to open. Like if somebody has a Black Lotus that's worth $100,000 and gas costs $100, maybe they want to pay it. But like, I don't think it's going to be necessary. And there's also a lot of knobs we can turn in terms of how often we write to the chain. Like we can combine a lot of transactions into one transaction. We can store cards temporarily and until you are ready to take like 100 cards at once. We can take rentals off the chain. We can do there are a number of things we can do to turn those knobs so that the system can bend without breaking. But if it breaks, we just have to go off chain with more transactions, I think. I don't think there's going to be like a random other chain. Like there's not going to be, EOS or Bitcoin or, Stellar or something. It's not going to suddenly have the ability to handle this transaction load.
Neil Zupancitz asks, how much impact do you think bad messaging from authority figures has on individual and group behavior towards the pandemic? In other words, for example, in a world where Fauci said exactly the right things at exactly the right times, how much better off would we be, if at all?
I think we'd be a lot better off. I think that there's several dynamics going on here. I could talk for a long time about this question because it's one of the things that I've been interested about lately. I find to figure out exactly how these things work. But first of all, the mask thing did a ton of damage. If they had encouraged everybody to cut cloth masks, we have examples of this happening, like in the Czech Republic, for example, where like literally people just took their cloth, cut cloth masks out, and distributed cloth masks to everybody within a few days. And then everybody had cloth masks because they would have believed them and they would have done it if they had said it was a good idea. The same way they did it when the messaging finally got through that they should do it. And they also could have then they also could have separately lifted regulations preventing the quick manufacturing of various other better masks. But like that's a separate question. But so like we could have gotten masks out much faster. And that would have been a dramatically better world in many ways if that messaging had been correct. There wouldn't have been as much anti-mask, I think, if there hadn't, like, a lot of the anti-masking is residue of the fact that, like, it was presented as a case at first, and therefore it was already plausible to everybody that masks were bad. So, like, if masks had been treated as transparently good from day one, as in, like, well, all of the Asian countries that have experienced SARS on a regular basis know that masks work. Masks are just what you do, right? Like, if Fauci and Trump had been on this page, right, and everybody along the line had the right messaging, I think we would have seen almost universal masks basically everywhere, almost immediately. It would have just been the norm. And that in itself would have saved us probably more than half the people who died, I think. If you just do the math on what would have happened. We would have stabilized at much lower levels. Similarly, like other messaging, like when you tell people the wrong thing, it's interesting dynamics. But first of all, when you give people a rule, they tend to be either stupidly adherent to the exact rule or ignore the rule entirely and everything around it. These are the two most common reactions. So when I tell you 6 feet apart, you are making a compromise where you expect a lot of people to give lip service to attempting to be 6 feet apart, but treat 6 feet and 7 feet apart as the same. And 7 feet and 12 feet apart is also the same. And like basically treat 6 feet apart as like not close to each other. And then also not know what 6 feet is because humans are really bad at this kind of thing. And therefore like end up being 3 or 4 feet apart a lot. That's neither here nor there. But it's more like you're not teaching people to think about their physical situation. And so like they're not going to not look at each other when they talk. They're not going to keep their voices down. They're not going to aim down or away. They're not going to open a window and get ventilation. Like ventilation was a huge missed opportunity. If they had told people, fight COVID, open a window, there wasn't going to be a huge fight over window openings. Nobody hates windows that are open, unless it's really cold. They would just open the damn windows. Right? Like, of course. Why wouldn't they have? If they had said take vitamin D on I think at least a double-digit percentage of people who didn't take vitamin D would have taken vitamin D. It would have had a huge impact because, again, like, okay, maybe there's an anti-vitamin D denier crowd and like the Republicans decide that vitamin D is a lie and they refuse to take it, but so what? You still get half the country taking vitamin D, even then. And like, more than that, the continuous messaging has gotten people to a place where they treat the authorities' statements as magical incantations with which to avoid blame and with which to blame others and with which to justify their actions and fuck with each other, as opposed to allow you to understand the pandemic and how to avoid getting sick. And so you have situations where like schools are looking at the exact guidance issued by the CDC and insisting on doing exactly the thing that they said, including things like, well, for 15 minutes, it's close contact. Every 14 minutes, we're going to have a class break where everybody changes seats. Which is obviously much, much worse than not doing that. But a bunch of schools actually did this. Right? And this is because the government isn't telling us reasonable things. right? If they told us reasonable things, then other parts of the government and regular people would have done much more reasonable things, in my opinion. Now, you could argue control system, therefore nothing matters. And that's the counter argument to all of that, which is like, if the government had leveled with us, then we would have had better controls, but we would have then relaxed in other ways and we would have had the same problem. But I think we would have stabilized at least much less economic and social damage for the same level of containment, and probably would have gotten just a better frontier. We were like, did less damage to people's social and economic health, and also less damage to their physical health, right? When we're still on a trade-off system where we had a control system where we couldn't just smash it, we'd be in a better spot. But like, yeah, people are just like going around like with like incantations and acting like idiots. And it's like not necessary to a large extent.
Okay. One minute, yes. Viljame Virolainen asks, why do you think Michael Baker was successful in getting their elimination strategy to pass in New Zealand, while in most places attempts to replicate his success have been unsuccessful?
I think New Zealand is a tiny island that could afford to lock down really hardcore in terms of its travel and like other things, and that mattered more than everything else combined. Like the places like New Zealand really had a much physically easier task here, where it could plausibly squash. Like, what is the United States going to do, right? Suppose Michael Baker had been president of the United States and had a Congress that went along with him, and he passed an eradication plan. How are you going to keep that going in the United States for a year? Also, New Zealanders have much less of a like independent, cowboyish, like, you know, fear of government intrusion / insanity, partly because their government's been better for a long time and they have less reason to want one, but also just for different culture reasons. New Zealand has long been like, so I follow one New Zealand blogger and have for many years, and he has often described New Zealand as outside the asylum, where the asylum is the rest of the world, meaning that the rest of the world is crazy in various ways and New Zealand is relatively sane, and talks about various different things that New Zealand would like look at adapting things that other people were doing as becoming more and more part of the asylum. And in general, like New Zealand has a relatively well-functioning government. There's a reason why a lot of people, like for example, Peter Thiel, have like paid a bunch of money for New Zealand citizenship, so that if things get really bad, they can flee to New Zealand, where they think that the government is relatively stable and things would be relatively sane, and they could potentially maintain things. And it's not just because they have enough metal in the ground they could rebuild civilization if there was a nuclear war. Right? Like there are these weird considerations that people have, but there's also the practical consideration of this is a relatively well-functioning place that is like likely to be able to stay out of trouble when the shit hits the fan. And like that's very linked to we can afford to just eradicate COVID because we just don't have that much trade. What trade we do have is on ships. The ships can quarantine. We can do a bunch of other things like that. And also like there's sort of a very clear threshold effect where if you're good enough to eradicate, you should absolutely eradicate. And you end up paying a much smaller price to eradicate than you did to contain, the way the United States did, right? Like, was once you succeed, you continue to pay the full eradication price. And it's much lower than the containment price. You have to pay an upfront cost.
So let's take just a couple more questions, and then we'll go to Mingle. Isaac Leonard asks, the usual criticism of NFTs is that proof of work is a negative sum game. Is Tezos proof of stake based?
Yes.
Okay. That was nice and fast. Julian Felix Fleury asks, whenever you talk about the control system, you seem to emphasize the government. Are you sure it's even that important? I could see it just being public sentiment, coordinated by Twitter, media, and publicly available numbers. In general, have you thought more about societal control systems?
So when people ask multiple questions, I can't just give one-word answers, but to the first part, no. And I'm sorry that I said it in a way that gave you the impression that I thought the answer was yes. So basically, when I say the control system, I do not specifically mean the government. I mean collectively, the government, the media, the businesses, the people, all of us together, and we all have a hand in this. Like definitely regulations and the authorities and the messaging that they give and the rules they set are a large part of it. But also I do agree that a lot of the locking down happens without the government telling us to lock down. A lot of the avoidance is not something the government is trying to control directly or in any real way. And a lot of government mandates get ignored. And a lot of this comes down to the risk. And my model is something like the control system operates mostly on the death rate that is being observed more than anything else. And I think a lot of what has allowed us to continue, now that I think about it, dropping in cases faster than I would have expected and for more than I expected is the death rate didn't drop as much as I expected. And these two things are actually related. So what's happening is people are seeing the death rate stay high, and they are therefore not opening up as much as they would have otherwise. And therefore, R0 can maintain itself below 1 for a longer period than I would have expected. And so I was confused why these two things were diverging, and I should have actually not been confused why these two things were diverging, but instead simply asked why the death rate wasn't dropping. Because the other one made perfect sense in some important sense, right? Like one causes the other. I just didn't understand why the first one was happening. And I still don't really. I have theories, but it's not something I'm confident I understand, or that I would have. My true model isn't really predicted yet, which means I haven't understood it. But yeah, no, to answer the core question, when I think control system, I mean the whole thing. And I think if the government was literally not doing anything, we would still have a control system if we were insufficient, if we couldn't eradicate. It's not obvious we wouldn't just eradicate without the government. I think there's a good chance we would. But if we couldn't eradicate, then we would definitely have a control system.
Right, well, thank you, Steve. This is everybody's chance to unmute at long last, so we can applaud. Thank you. I enjoyed that. Now we're going to go to the Jitsi meetup rooms. So this is in your invitation, in your calendar. I also put it into the chat. And just move around between those rooms. Be careful not to have two rooms open at once, because then you get feedback between the different rooms. But this is our chance to meet each other from all over the world, to continue talking to Tzvi if you want, and if he's joining us. So here we go. Here are the Jitsi rooms. I'll hang out here on the Google Meet for a few minutes in case somebody has technical questions. But now we can head out of the major conference room and into the lobby where we chat with each other.